yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, so to demonstrate sufficient energy from specific physical resources that are contractually obligated to flow, or in the case of demand response, to actually curtail. The final is something that Frank Wolak has proposed and that we talk about a little bit in the paper, and that's totally replacing the current construct and replacing it with a fixed price forward energy requirement, but including a financial hedging component that allows for risk arbitrage and price discovery on the part of generators, which can result in lowered forward prices for customers. That's pretty complex, and we're not going to go over it today. Today, we just wanted to focus on the issues that we've seen and the concerns, and that was really what was in our paper and motivating this conversation in part. And I think with that, I'm pretty much going to open it up to questions, if there are any.
Thanks, Michelle. Maybe I do see some questions. I don't know, Simone, do you want to read through them?
Well, there's one question, a clarifying question about the analysis. Is the analysis of capacity and energy in 2022 later based on what's under contract as of September 2020, while leaving out all ongoing and planned procurement after September 2020?
Yes, so the data that is being used to produce the graphics is coming from the IRP filings that were submitted on September 1, 2020. And I think there was some refinements made to those in September and even into October to include an energy flag and an RA flag, as well as to report the contracted gigawatt hours. We recognize that there could be contracting that took place, after these forms were filled out that isn't being, reported in the analysis. And then additionally, it does not include planned. So planned existing and planned new is not included in that, in the graphics. So if you have a storage contract, a contract with a battery that's in review, then it is included. If it's planned, then it's not. If it's contracted, then it is.
Our next question is from Mary Neal. There are a lot of slides with analysis of long-term contracting and market power. What analysis is the CPUC doing to assess energy limitations of renewable resources and ensuring adequate reliability in all hours?
So this is Michelle, and I'll take that question. So I would note that the CPUC has adopted the ELCC framework, and we have reduced the capacity of wind and solar over time. So for example, I think the ELCC value for solar for September is 13%. It used to be much higher, and in fact, we're required to do an ELCC. If we did an exceedance methodology, which is what we did before, it's possible that it would be even lower. So the exceedance methodology actually looks at production during the period of concern, but the ELCC sort of looks at the overall reliability. So first I'd say that we have substantially reduced the capacity counting value. And if you go back, Simone, to the tight supply picture, you can see that the amount of solar and wind that we're counting on is pretty low. One more. So you can see that the amount of sun is yellow and the amount of wind is green. So the amount of capacity that we're actually counting on in September has decreased substantially. So that's one way we've been addressing this issue. The second issue is the availability over the peak. So if that solar and wind is not available, you probably want to make sure that you're going to meet your net peak hours. Part of that, we can't create anything out of nothing. So we need new resources here. And that's why the CPUC has authorized additional storage resources. We're hoping that the storage resources move the daytime or the nighttime to that net peak hour, and that can help us address that time. We hope to do some stack analyses and also some scenario analyses, and also rely on participation of the parties to bring forward their concerns, their suggestions to address this issue of importance to us all, I would imagine. Thank you.
And I also would note that we did revise the MCC buckets in the June decision to limit resources, providing a use limited cap on demand response, and then also even limiting the amount that solar and wind could count in bucket 4 towards meeting the minimum requirement of that bucket.
Oh, and I just wanted to say one more thing. As part of the load impact process, what we do is we assess the utilities and actually all demand response programs to see how we count them for resource adequacy. One of the things we do is one of the things we have been doing is assessing those demand response products for the hours. I believe it's either 4 or 9 p.m. or 5 or 9 p.m., whatever the availability assessment hours. And as you'll note, a lot of the utilities DR counting has gone down substantially. So maybe it was 2,500 and maybe now it's 1,300. And that really is a product of the fact that the peak is moved later in the day. And we're reflecting the fact that air conditioning DR programs can't provide the reliability benefits over those times of concern anymore. So that's another way in which we've been trying to keep up with the moving net load peak or peak.
It looks like Mary still has a question. So Linon, why don't you unmute her and see if there's a follow-up?
A moment.
Well, while she's figuring that out, we have, oh no, she doesn't have a question. So our next question is from Luke Chugas about the statement on slide 42 that demand response resources are seemingly bidding above their marginal costs. What analysis was done to come to this conclusion, and does this conclusion include reliability demand response?
Yes. So DMM has done a bunch of analysis of this, and hopefully they'll include it in their next report. In addition, we get bidding data, settlement data, and dispatch data. So we can see what resources and what providers are bidding. And we'd note that many of the third-party DR are bidding, if not at the cap, close to the cap, which makes them less likely to be dispatched. That's one issue. In addition, I think we've also seen in the master file that some third-party demand response have put in startup costs or maybe no load cost, which actually increases the price. So that makes it even more likely that they're going to be less likely for them to get dispatched. So that's the analysis that we've been doing and will continue to do. But that does raise some pretty significant concerns on our part.
All right, do we have any more questions?
Looks like we have some people who would like to ask. If you can unmute Stephanie Tanninghouse.
Sorry, I don't have a question. I'm
Okay.
the confusion.
Paul Nelson.
What's the full name?
Paul Nelson. And if you don't have a question, if you could press on that question mark again, so it will go down, so we won't see you as wanting to ask a question.
Paul Nelson, you are unmuted. Paul Nelson?
Okay. Let's try Sue Mara. Can you unmute Sue?
Yes. Sue.
Mara.
Oh, While we're waiting for Sue to be unmuted, I'll answer. John Gooden has a question. Is IOU-DR in the other category in the ELC slides shown earlier? If not, how is DR accounted for in the energy and capacity slides? Yes, that is where DR is accounted for in that unknown category. And again, we hope to do some more cleaning of the data to make sure that the DR is pulled out and allocated correctly across all ELSEs, but that is how it is being reported.
Sue, you're unmuted.
Okay, thank you. I tried to submit the question through Q&A, but maybe didn't go through. Anyway, my questions go way back to the beginning of Michelle's presentation when you were talking about tolling agreements. And it seemed to me that you were saying or indicating that tolling agreements are preferable to RA only contracts. And I just wondered if you could explain that more.
Sure. So let's see. So in general, the utilities have had the resources under tolling agreements under the cost allocation mechanism. So in like 2006, we authorized the utilities to build a lot of resources. At that point in time, we determined that no one really wanted to build them, but the utilities would do so on behalf of all customers. So it turns out this has two benefits, one of which is the utilities have the dispatch rights on those facilities. So we're guaranteed to get all the energy under a certain price. We don't have to bid it in and then buy it out of the CAISO. The other thing is that the utilities are under requirements from the CPUC that they must bid economically. So they must bid marginal costs, and that they must actually provide the data on their bids in their ERA filings. So we're sure that those resources, and it goes back to that slide where I show you the bidding of the net buyers and the net sellers. So the net buyers are bidding consistent with the default energy bid. So we're going to say that they are bidding economically. We're seeing that the bidding behavior of the net sellers is different. So that's in part why it's good to have those under tolling agreements. I think it's really good for the entire market. And that's part of the reason I think it's worked so well, is we've had both the bidding behavior of them disciplines the market, and secondly, we have the energy on it. So that's a physical hedge. And the physical hedge is on behalf of all customers, not just the IOU customers, because it's a CAM resource. So as you know, with CAM resources, if they make revenues, all those revenues go back through the CAM mechanism.
And another related question is that it's when you were talking again about the IOUs are declining in their signing of tolling agreements, of course, because they're losing load. Were you also suggesting that other parties, the ESPs and the CCAs, should therefore be sort of picking the slack there in signing tolling agreements?
I don't dictate what the ESPs and CCAs do. However, I think it is critically important if we want to avoid the mistakes of the past to have hedging, and tolls are one form of hedge.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Our next question is from Noah Tong.
And let me, before we take that call, I just want to do a time check. We're coming up against the 1:45 mark, so we do need to move on after this question. How many more do we have in the queue, Simone?
I see 2 more, so maybe we can do them quickly.
Okay.
All right. Has ED performed an analysis of overall costs for a hypothetical LSE that used to have PPTAs versus today when it's RA only and they buy energy from the market to serve their load?
No, that's an interesting analysis, but you'd also have to take into account that power purchase agreements built new resources, so they were more expensive. I don't anticipate that the generators would build new resources for the price of those contracts. It's an interesting analysis, and I'd totally love to do it, and I'll talk to you about that offline.
Let's sneak in this last question from Tom Beach. Your slides show that LSEs are far short of fully contracting their energy requirements on a forward basis. If your second option were adopted, where would LSEs look to contract more forward energy? What resources are uncontracted?
Well, as we show, most resources are uncontracted, many resources are uncontracted for energy. So there's nothing that prevents people that have sold their RA from selling their energy under a forward fixed contract or any other kind of contract.
Okay, so we're going to move on to PG&E's presentation. Linan, would you get or mind grabbing Peter Griffiths from the attendee list and making him a panelist?
Peter,
haven't
I
done
think
so
you are a
already?
panel. I think you are a panelist right now.
Great.
Peter?
I think
Just have to get myself off mute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Peter Griffiths. I am the Chief of Comprehensive Procurement Framework for PG&E. And I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of where we came in on the Track 3B and how we're thinking about things. And so, next slide, please. The topics I'm going to talk about, each of these fairly briefly. First is expectations in terms of what are we trying to get done in this process. I think Jamie may have explained some of this already, so I don't know if I'm going to spend a whole lot of time there. But there's also then principles, because that is what PG&E filed in August. And I'll talk a little bit about what those are and why we did that and why we didn't come up with a proposal per se. I did want to highlight incentives. I think for the most part, a good bit of what Michelle has talked about goes to sort of what are the incentives for parties and how are they related across markets, essentially from the RA construct through the energy construct, and how much of a link should there be between those two types of markets. And then finally, counting. I want to talk briefly about counting because I think all of the proposals that have been put forward to date, to some degree, have some measure of changing the counting or at least extending the counting from what we have. And it might make some sense to start discussions about how that might take place when we move forward. So next slide, please. So what are we trying to get done by when? The PUC is really teed up a very large structural change and for replacing of sort of the existing system with one that's better suited to the changing resource mix. And I think everybody agrees that that's what is was very much on the table. We do have a number of proposals that people have put forward, though, and the question to some degree in my mind is how many of those are large structural changes that will take along the timeline that was put forward by Energy Division in terms of, and Jamie, in terms of not coming to fruition or into implementation until, say, 2023 or 2024. And how many of those things can we think about making on a quicker time frame? And how much can we get done that would improve the current situation until we get to a larger structural change? And anything that we do in that regard needs to improve or make improvements on the current program and more or less and not get in the way of any structural change in terms of the way we're working on these things. And I guess from PG&E's perspective, we think that these discussions in Track 3B should probably be following or at least thinking about things in these ways. Now, it might make sense for some of the things that might be implemented earlier to be thrown into Track 4, which is looking at a 2022 implementation. But there might also be things that we wouldn't be able to get done by 2022, but could be done by 2023. So I just want to highlight that because I think we should be thinking about that. Now, this conversation is largely about structural, and that is something I think we need to make some progress on, and it is going to need some discussion, time, and effort to be able to move forward. So next slide, please. Principles. I did want to talk briefly about the principles that PG&E put forward in August because we did not put together a proposal per se, But what we did do was to put together principles by which we would look at any proposals that were put forward and sort of how were they working. The first thing I want to say is from PG&E's perspective, reliability is basically the thing that is necessary above all else. We need to be focused on maintaining system reliability and setting up a program, a resource adequacy program that maintains and establishes a reliability. Any of the other goals that are set forward, I think, should be kept in mind and be somewhat secondary to the idea of maintaining reliability, and shouldn't take necessarily a backseat to it. That said, we support the public policy objectives and the wanting to move in that direction. But again, we don't want those things to essentially get in the way of maintaining reliability. We also wanted to promote efficient investment and operations of the system. I think that's relatively straightforward and self-explanatory. Cost allocation is also wanting to make sure that that is a part of any sort of program that gets discussed and moved forward, particularly in cost causation, making sure that costs go to those who are causing them. And that there isn't some aspects of putting costs off on other parties. We think risk should be fairly and efficiently divided and shared in terms of who's taking what risk and how that should move forward. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about mitigate the exercise of market power. This is, to some degree, less about market power per se, but making sure that we've got the incentives right and having the incentives. And I'm going to talk a little more about that on the next slide. But, Michelle has put forward certainly Energy Division's perspective on how the program has worked and how the aspects of the program have not developed in the same sort of way that they should have moved forward. And from PG&E's perspective, we think incentives are very important, and we want to make sure that we look very closely at incentives, and it's not just incentives in meeting capacity requirements or RA requirements, but also as what implications are there for incentives in the energy market. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. And then finally, it's promote innovation and to be robust to alternative changes and alternative structures. So let me go to the next slide. Incentives. We think a lot of the discussion needs to focus on incentives and to be looking at incentives in terms of what are the incentives that are being set up. How are these incentives going to be acted upon? I think it's pretty well understood that people and parties pretty much act in their own self-interest. And so anything that gets developed, we want to make sure has an awareness of how the individual incentives line up with being able to prevent an efficient and equitable system as a whole. And this, to some degree, gets to some of the things that Michelle was talking about in terms of tolling arrangements. The tolling arrangements, because an LSE has a tolling arrangement, they're essentially buying the energy, and they're buying it at a fixed cost. They want to play the market in the right way in terms of if the tolling agreement that they have with the plant costs more than what the market price is, they don't really want to operate the plant. If, on the other hand, the electricity price is lower than, the electricity price is higher than essentially the cost of operating, then it makes sense for the tolling arrangement to take place and to essentially bid in at those marginal costs. And it does provide, as Michelle also indicated, a hedge. And I think this is a fairly important aspect of the RA program that the commission has signaled in terms of dispatch rights. I think people will recall that in the CPE decision, the commission very much indicated that they wanted the CPEs essentially to be soliciting dispatch rights from any of the capacity that they were procuring to meet local requirements. And there's a reason for this. And so I think this is something that we need to make sure is taken into account when we're talking about alternatives and talking about programs. And it really gets down to the question of how does the capacity structure influence the energy market behavior and in the incentives in the energy market. And these are certainly questions that I think need to be asked and they need to be considered when looking at any of the proposals. Next slide, please. Finally, there's counting. And I wanted to sort of call out counting separately, largely because of the fact that we currently have a capacity at peak type of framework or capacity at peak metric in terms of how we're thinking about things. And I think we all realize that because of the nature of the resources on the system, we can't just be thinking about peak demand. We also have to be thinking about other hours and other times of the day. And I think for the most part, all of the programs that we're thinking about or changes we're thinking about making are going to have to look at more hours of the day or at least more metrics. Certainly the proposals that have been put on the table to date, in particular the EDIS and CalCCA proposal, has an explicit NQE or net qualifying energy construct. I also think if you look at some of the MCC bucket changes, there'll be some question as to sort of what could resources provide in terms of what timeframes, and you know, those types of things get at a different type of metric for counting than we have currently under capacity at peak. And so this might be a topic that we can start talking about separately without regard to essentially which direction we actually go in terms of structure and how we move. Just in realizing that there are going to be a need for alternative measures of how a resource essentially provides to meeting provides a product essentially to meeting the RA requirement. And so, you know, the key considerations to some degree that we've seen are sort of when are resources going to be needed, you know, and how should it be counting in the periods that they are needed. And finally, I wanted to give a storage call out because this is something that certainly from my personal perspective is something that is going to come in at us in a fairly quick time frame, largely because a good bit of the capacity that we have coming on in the next couple of years is storage. And it's not at all clear that we have the metrics set up correctly to be able to handle how storage is going to be able to play in providing resource adequacy. And it's not just capacity at peak, it also has to do with some of the other aspects of it. And so there's a question of that, as well as how the storage and hybrid resources are going to be put together. And I think those are things that may need some discussion and modification before we get to a larger structural change. With that, let me open it up for questions.
Thank you, Peter. We are at 2 o'clock, so we'll go to the Q&A. I think there's one. Simone, do you want to read it?
Yeah, well, it's more of an administrative question. Will there be comments on this workshop, or is January 15th the next time, there will be the next opportunity for formal comments on track 3B.
Yeah, the answer is January 15th is what the schedule has allotted for formal comments on revised proposals. So there could be discussions with parties after the workshop, not in a public forum, but if there was further questions or, concerns that parties had that they wanted to bring to parties with proposals so that they could address those concerns maybe in the next iteration, that would be a way of doing so. But there won't be a public, or not public, but a formal reply comment schedule before then. There is
Just
somebody.
check, did Jim Caldwell, should we, I'm not sure, do you have a question? We can unmute you.
I had the same trouble that Sue did. I'm not sure. I tried this. I had a question about the last presentation, so it's too late.
Do you want to go ahead and ask your question, Jim, while you're unmuted?
Okay, I guess. I just had a quick question for Michelle, and that is when you say exports, does that mean out of state or just out of the California Balancing Authority? I've had some complaints from folks who got their in-state who were short of things who got their schedule cut. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'd have to defer to CAISO on that. I would guess it's exports out of the CAISO system, but that just means they're not available to us. So, however, I would also guess in my looking at the information at the ties that there were substantial exports out of state as well. In addition, I have been looking at the WECC soft offer cap filings. There were 19 or 20 of them, because people bought or sold the price cap of $1,000. So when I look at those filings, a lot of folks were buying out of the CAISO market at above 1,000, and so at least one of them has reported that. So I'm pretty sure that a large portion of this was out of state.
Thank you.
All right. If we don't have any other questions, then we will take our break. I believe the break is 15 minutes from 2 to 2:15.
Right.
All right, so we'll just go on mute and then come back with our, we'll get Edison as well as East Bay designated as panelists for the next round when we get back. All right, see you all or talk to you all in a few.
think I'm actually gonna go first and then hand things over to Eric. Can folks hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. That
Okay.
sounds good.
Perfect, thanks. And also just logistically, I think we'll probably do Q&A after both the CalCCA and NSCE presentations, unless there are burning questions based on these few slides. But this should be pretty quick. You know, the SCE and CalCCA proposal has already been mentioned a few times today, so I think there is, you know, general knowledge of the proposal. We just thought it would be useful to spend a few minutes here laying some of the groundwork, and then I'll kick things over to Eric to talk more about process and dig into some of the details. So we see this framework as offering key structural changes that address the shortcomings of the existing paradigm, many of which have been identified today. And so those changes include an emphasis on net rather than gross peak, incorporating energy sufficiency, and also evaluating storage charging needs. So we believe that the proposal sort of moves those issues forward and offers a balanced approach to reforming RA that provides that necessary change, but is not overly complex or limiting or you know, overly costly to implement. But we do recognize that there are additional program elements that will need to be continued to develop. I think that this is true really under any transition, you know, particularly if it's a significant overhaul of what we have today. So I don't think that's especially unique to this proposal, but we do think that it is compatible with those incremental refinements. And then also we see it as compatible with the other existing processes that the CPUC and CAISO have in place that also address reliability. So the RA program has a really key role in reliability, but it doesn't act entirely alone, and it's not really designed to. So it's really, you know, one piece of a broader ecosystem, and our proposal is designed to enhance the coordination between those existing processes. Next slide. So I think we've established during today's discussion that there's relatively broad agreement on several aspects of the current RA program design that aren't particularly well suited for the makeup of California's evolving grid. So our proposal addresses what we see as the most significant aspects, but also leaves room for incremental improvements and refinements. So for example, this has been mentioned several times, the current program really focuses around gross peak capacity and may overlook the most challenging reliability hours, which are at and around the net peak. And there's also currently no metric for ensuring energy sufficiency. And that is increasingly a concern as there are more renewables and uncertainty in terms of the energy they're able to provide, and also storage. So this proposal really refocuses RA procurement around the monthly net peak and incorporates tests for both you know, the overall energy sufficiency of the portfolio to meet both load and also storage charging needs. So we see those as really significant improvements, but there's of course still room for further development, and that could be potentially revisiting the PRM, examining different load forecasts and the must offer obligations, as well as, you know, changes to the counting rules, like CAISO's UCAP proposal. Next slide. So this slide is to illustrate my earlier point that RA is one of several mutually reinforcing elements of our multi-part reliability framework. So, you know, we have a progression of policies that each play a role over a different time horizon, starting with the mid to longer term planning that occurs in the IRP, and as well as procurement coming out of that IRP. And so that's really, you know, hopefully ensuring that the resource fleet that is necessary for reliability gets built. And then that feeds into the RA program and compliance, which is ensuring adequate resources are under contract and available. Then finally, the actual resource dispatch in the ISO market. So, well, you know, we strongly believe that the RA program and requirements should mirror the grid needs. We also think that it's important to avoid an overly complex or overly costly framework. And so we see, you know, some simplifications necessary for feasibility and market fluidity. And those simplifications are really, you know, acceptable, if not kind of expected, given the integration of the IRP and CAISO portfolio assessment and CPM processes. Next slide. So just to summarize all of that, all RA programs require some amount of simplification because we're translating really complicated probabilistic outcomes of loss of load into compliance metrics that can be easily measured and tracked and offer enough market certainty. And so, you know, that in-depth modeling is still occurring, and it's occurring in multiple other venues. And that information, you know, can and should be incorporated into the metrics that we're using for the RA program, but doesn't necessarily need to be reflected in that complexity in the program itself. So we also want to acknowledge that, you know, to the extent that any simplifications may leave room for certain edge cases where, you know, under the proposal, a portfolio, you know, checks the boxes, but in reality isn't performing in the way that it's intended to. We definitely, you know, want to acknowledge the possibility of that and consider those. You know, there's potentially more work to do there, but we also recognize that the program by design is kind of one piece of this overall framework for reliability, and that there are other processes in place to guardrail against potential risks. So with that, I will hand things over to Eric.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I looked and see that there's only 166 attendees, and I don't play to small crowds, so we can just skip over my portion. This is not much fun when you're not here and you can't see if people chuckle, although they never do, so I guess it's not that much different. Some of this you've already heard. I'm going to reiterate some points that others have made. You can see the schedule that is up here from the most recent as to how we're going to get through this thing. And it has a final decision occurring on Track 3B in June of 2021. When I look back at the progress that this has made, originally Track 3 was this quote-unquote blue sky thinking process that we were going to go through, which to me really was what are the fundamental structural changes that we would have of this market. And it's morphed into Track 3B, where we have not only that, but we also have kind of the typical host of, you know, half a dozen to a dozen different items that people want to have addressed. And given that, I think we need to have some concentration on exactly what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So we've got this issue of what are we trying to get to by the time we get to the middle of next year? And I think that this was discussed a little bit earlier today at the very beginning of this. Are we trying to get to a fully implementable solution? Are we trying to get to something else? And in my view, I tend to agree with the presentation from Jamie earlier. I think a fully implementable proposal by the time we get to the middle of next year is pretty infeasible. Because we've got multiple different proposals out there right now. And I think what we really need to do is to be able to effectively get through this is to seek out a single solution by that point in time, either a single solution or at least narrow it down to two competing proposals at that point in time that we will go through more thoroughly. I think that to get there, what we need to be able to do is to work in these workshops to be able to figure out what are the unmovable rocks in each of these proposals. Are there any? And if there aren't any, then is there something that looks more desirable out of one than another so that we can narrow this down to what we're really trying to accomplish and really trying to get to? I think to Peter's point earlier about, you know, there being certain interim proposals that we can get to, and I think the way that Peter had worded it was, how many of those do we want to get to? I'd look at it a little bit differently. I would look at it as, which ones of those do we need to be able to continue operating the current system until we're able to get this longer term solution in place? The problem with a half dozen to a dozen different proposals is that can consume a whole lot of time. And so I think we really need to look through those and ask ourselves, which are the ones that are necessary to be able to maintain reliability under the current structure while we look to make structural improvements to this and maybe loop in those other issues into that of to how we're going to address them in that space. So I think that we do need to quickly make some decisions here. And if we can move on to the next page. Can't remember if this was it for this or not. So we had suggested some ways to narrow these options down by looking at each of them to look at whether or not there's kind of no-go determinations on any of these. And then utilize these workshops to work on the different elements, and we'll get to that on the SCE/CalCCA proposal here in a moment, where kind of going through the next level discussion on what we need to know to be able to address some of these. I'm not looking for these workshops to be what would be the implementable solution that you would propose to figure out whether it's a go, no go, but what conceptually are we thinking about to understand whether or not there is significant difficulty with them. I do think that it's going to require quite a number of workshops to get to the middle of next year. We're kind of at our first one right here. And really need to get to the point where we sit down and go over each of the individual proposals and look at the various elements of them and start asking the questions as to how they would work. So can we go to the next page? Okay, so that was the end of that section. And I suppose what I really want to understand from Energy Division is, how are we going to get clarity on what it is that we are trying to accomplish by the middle of next year so that we can start setting out in the direction to be able to accomplish it? My fear is that we'll conduct a whole lot of workshops on these topics, but they'll be potentially disjointed, and will get us to a point in the middle of next year where, you know, we're not sure about how to make a decision on anything because we didn't have a focused process to go through to really get ourselves there. So again, my suggestion is that we kind of loop it into two pieces. One piece is to figure out which of the non-structural changes, non-big structural changes are necessary just to maintain the current program for the next year or 2 years. And then the other is to look through the various proposals for structural changes to figure out which one of them looks like it has the highest probability of making it through, such that the middle of next year we could get an order out that says, go pursue this and figure out how to implement this solution by X date. So let me just kind of pause right there and ask if there's anybody from Energy Division staff who has an opinion on how we get to that.
This is Jamie. I don't know if Michelle has an opinion, but I guess I'll turn it around and ask you, what would you need direction-wise from the Commission or Energy Division staff to feel clear and get there? Like what do you envision that being?
Yeah, I suppose what I would like to see is a scope and schedule that defines the elements that we're trying to get to, and preferably in the manner that I just described. That the investigation of the non-long-term structural changes are focused around what is necessary to be able to get through the next year or two as the structural changes are being developed, and we will have separate workshops to discuss those. And then we will have another set of workshops to be able to discuss the structural changes to get to a point by the middle of next year that we have an understanding of which option we will be pursuing, with then further process to be able to develop the actual implementation of those. If we can get that in writing, I think that will help to facilitate these meetings that we're going to be going through so that we all know when we show up to a meeting what the discussion is going to be on.
And would you envision then both of these two kind of parallel processes in Track 3B would result in a decision in June of 2021? I know they'd be different, addressing two separate things, but result in a June decision, or do you envision one of the tracks would be the longer term track would not have the same June 2021 urgency?
No, I'd still like to see the June 2021 urgency, because I would like to see that decision narrow down which of the options we're going to go through. I have a feeling that if we decide we're going to take another, instead of 6 months, we're going to take 18 months, or we're going to take, 30 months to get through that trying to work to implementable solutions for all of the proposals that are out there for structural changes will quite simply be a daunting task. I don't think we can realistically get there. I would rather have this stepped phase where we figure out which one of the options we think has the most hope, and then start working on implementation details. Because in my opinion, those implementation details are going to include things like, what does the planning reserve margin look like? What does the must offer obligation look like? All of the types of things that we had to go through in the original RA decisions, I think you will have to go back through again to make sure that the new structure is going to work on a going forward basis. Because it certainly in the SCE Cal CCA proposal, there's a number of different elements that change the nature of the unknowns, and so looking at planning reserve margin again becomes important. And even if you aren't changing those types of things, there's a number of questions out there about what the uncertainties really look like. Is the planning reserve margin appropriate for things like forced outages and ancillary services and load forecast error? So we've got that at a minimum, and then depending upon the proposal, it may introduce additional items of uncertainty that we have to figure out how to address those as well. So I do think that there's a lot of work that has to be done in those spaces to figure out what loss of load expectation we are seeking to address, and how you best do that through these various programs. And I think that is a fairly lengthy process, and trying to do that for all of the proposals at the same time is going to be incredibly time consuming. I think that going through and looking at the structure in general and the basic construct to be able to figure out whether or not there's something that is unworkable is probably the better way to go about it before preparing all of those details.
And would you, Eric, final question, would you be looking for this direction prior to the December 18th revised proposals coming in? Or would you recommend possibly that in those revised proposals that they lump themselves, into two potential groupings of, fast track versus longer term?
I think it's fairly evident which ones are the interim solutions and which ones are the longer term the structural changes. So I don't know that they necessarily need to be separated out for that. I think that just to make progress on this item, we really need to understand that, because it's going to be all the workshops and discussions around them that I think need to be separated out. Trying to have a workshop where we're going to talk about both of these items at once, I think, is going to become incredibly time consuming. Okay, so we can go ahead and move to the next page. This was just a break between the two sections here. There is only one page to this presentation. I know everybody's going to say, well, why are we scheduled for 45 minutes? And it's because this page alone could take several hours if we really wanted to get into a discussion on it. So SCE and CalCCA have presented the proposal on quite a number of occasions to give the basic structure and background, and I'm going to assume that most people have seen this at this point. I think we even attached the presentation material to the filing of the proposal itself. So I think that people are pretty familiar with the concept where we're moving from a peak load need to a net peak load need, taking the renewable resources as a net against the load, and then using RA to fill in the net peak need from non-wind and solar resources. And then adding to that a category to account for energy rather than trying to continue to use the MCC buckets that we think are becoming problematic because they were mainly designed around contractual obligations that aren't really relevant any longer. And as we've gone through those meetings, we've had a number of different questions about how some different things are addressed. And this is a bullet point list of a few of them. There is one more that's been brought up to us by OEA, and they're going to address that next in their own presentation. So I won't go through that one, but it's another one that I would add to this list of things that we need to address. So let me just go through them here relatively quickly because I think there will likely be a lot of Q&A on these. So the first one is this temporal aspect. We have said that we need to have a net qualifying capacity to be able to meet the net peak load. And we need to have a new term, net qualifying energy, which is really looking at can I satisfy my load needs in all hours? And one of the points that's been brought up, and rightfully so, is that if I have a 100 megawatt hour resource that is available over 30 days in equal increments, how do you prevent this counting mechanism from treating that 100 megawatt hour resource to meeting 100 megawatts in one single hour when it can't do it, right? It's going to take 30 days for it to get to 100 megawatt hours. And so you can't possibly produce that within 1 hour. The resource is incapable of doing it. The accounting mechanism might falsely predict that you have sufficient resources to be able to meet that need. And we've said for a while now this is a legitimate concern, and that it does indeed need to be addressed. Sorry, that was a legitimate concern, just in case anybody heard that as illegitimate, that we need to address, and we probably need to do it during some workshops. I know that the ISO recently has put out their portfolio assessment. I think that there's some material in there that can help us to evaluate this. I think that we really need to look at, given the structure of the resources that are out there on the grid today and the portfolios that people would procure, how probable of a problem is this, and how large is the magnitude of that problem so that we can figure out what types of bumper lanes you would put in place to avoid this type of a problem. There's a number of different solutions to this. And they vary in degree of how direct they are or how general they are. And I fear using something that would be very general may require a lot of over-procurement that is unnecessary, as to where if you found out that the problem was relatively small, you might be able to get something that's much more direct. I think as a general matter, I believe that the portfolios of resources that people can select from today, I kind of tend to doubt that this is a gigantic problem right now, but could become one as we evolve the grid further and continue to retire resources that are available 24/7. Having said that, I also think that, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, the IRP has to play a role in that, right? So we have to look forward and understand what resources we're going to have on the grid. The IRP needs to be capable of building resources that can meet these needs in all hours, such that they're being built, so that the RA program is selecting from resources that are already capable of meeting the grid's needs. So no doubt this temporal aspect issue has to be addressed. How it gets addressed, I think, is something for further conversation. I think we need some studies to be done to really understand the magnitude of the problem. I think we probably need the help of the ISO to do that, because they know what the entire portfolio of resources looks like. And so what the possible combinations of portfolios could look like, and therefore how big of a problem this really is. And I think this is something that we should be digging into in some workshops to really better understand. The next one is this concept of NQE, net qualifying energy. So this is, you know, that 10 megawatt resource that can produce 100 megawatt hours during the month. How do you get that 100 megawatt hours? What is that NQE? And you know, in the presentations that we've done on this before, we've said, look, for some resources, it's very simple. For something that's available 24/7, it's the NQC of the resource times 24 hours times the number of days in the month. But that's not the vast majority of our resources. We do get into these interesting use limitations. And some of them are hourly limitations, and some of them are air permit limitations, and some of them are number of start limitations. So you get to some really bizarre combinations where, you know, the start limit is 1 start per month. Well, is the NQE the number of hours in the month times the capacity of that resource? Because if you start it on the first hour of the month and run it for the entire month, that's what it can produce. Or do we need to recognize that that resource is likely to shut down at some point during that time and have burned up the 1 start that it has and therefore is no longer available? So we really do need to sit down and start talking about the different categories of resources and how to figure out what an NQE calculation for each of them looks like. We also have to talk about, in that same space, how you allocate those out by month. So, you know, a good example would be either a hydro resource or a resource with air permit limitations, where it's more of an annual type of a limit. How do you allocate that month to month? Is this up to the seller of the resource? You know, for example, if I know that I've got 20,000 megawatt hours for the year, as the owner, I get to decide which months I'm going to sell those 20,000 megawatt hours, or is there some other process that we utilize to dictate which months those can be sold within? So those are the types of things that we need to start figuring out. NQC is much easier because it's really based upon the peak capacity of the resource, and that doesn't really change month to month, other than ambient condition type of stuff. But we've got simple methods to deal with that. The energy, on the other hand, is really a choice variable of when you're going to operate the resource. And so I think we need to have more thought process put into that. Well, when you're going to operate the resource and what the use limitations are in operating the resource. So I do think that there will need to be some workshops on that to sit down and have discussions about what is the art of the possible there. And is there, and again, this is in the vein of, are there any immovable objects as we go through this? Is there anything that we think is just unsolvable? Difficult is one thing, unsolvable is another. The next one that goes along with this is the must-offer obligation. So just suppose for a moment that you have this NQE resource that is limited, and they decide to allocate it out over 2 months. It's got 500 megawatt hours that it can provide, and it's going to provide 250 megawatt hours in August and 250 megawatt hours in September. And that's what's been shown in an RA plan. What happens to the must-offer obligation of that resource? Is in August, when it hits its 250th megawatt hour, is it now done for the rest of the month? It is use limit reached, and it no longer has a must-offer obligation? Or is it required to continue to produce energy, knowing full well that that's going to remove and reduce the amount of energy that was supposed to be available for perhaps a different load-serving entity in a different month? And how do we deal with those types of things? Because it's really kind of untenable to have a resource run out of its number of hours of energy in a month and then be unavailable to the other buyer in the next month. That's kind of a risk that the LSE is not likely to want to take on. So we do have to work through things like that. What does that must-offer obligation look like? And that, I think we need some workshops on, and we definitely need some input from the ISO as to how they would deal with those types of things. The netting of wind and solar. The question that we've asked for a bit now is should this be a transactable product? And this was the one that I'm going to kind of split this into 2 pieces here, because I think this was really the OEA issue that I'm going to really let them address. But if you have, the question really becomes, Edison has said that you can net this against your load. Well, what does that mean? What do you have to have bought to be able to net it against your load? Is it an RPS contract or is it an RA contract? Should this be separable? Is it feasible that someone could sell the RPS to one party and sell the RA netting from the wind and solar resource to a different party? And as we've been thinking through it at Edison, I'm not sure that it can't. I think that the big issue we have to really address there is if there are any existing contract issues associated with doing that. For SCE, our pro forma is generally that Edison has bought all of the products that come along with that renewable resource. So I don't think there's any question in our contracts that we've already bought both. But I'm not sure if other people have done the same in their contracting, and if this now opens up the possibility that parties are going to be arguing about whether or not the capability of netting this has been sold to the buying party or not. So I do think that we need to have discussions about that within these workshops to make sure that we are not creating problems with existing contracts that can't be resolved through this process. And it's a quantifiable issue. People ought to be able to say whether or not this is an issue within their contract or not. The other transactable product, oh, sorry, I just saw a note that Calwea raised this, not OEA. Sorry, I got the wrong party. Thank you, Nancy. The other issue about a transactable product has been the idea of, is NQC and NQE, are they separate products? Can you buy and sell them separately? Can I buy the capacity from a resource and some other load serving entity has bought the energy, the net qualifying energy from that resource? And again, you can imagine a situation in which there's one party that is, through the set of resources that they have, is very long in terms of energy, and another party is short on energy but has sufficient capacity. And when you total up the two of them, the system's needs are met. It seems a bizarre outcome to say that you have one entity that's deficient and is going to be penalized when the overall needs of the grid have been met. So is there an opportunity now for people to do transactions around that to where the energy piece by itself can be bought by the other party? And as long as it ends up with an offer obligation, then things are generally taken care of. Again, that goes back to this issue of what does it mean to reach a use limitation, given the situation that one party is now counting it as capacity, and that capacity may dry up at the point that the energy is gone. So again, all discussions that we need to have. The final one that has been brought to our attention is on hybrid resources, and the question is, do they need to be accounted for differently? Or is it as easy as just saying, no, the accounting mechanism under this structure is to treat them as if they're separate resources, net the renewable piece off of the load, and treat the battery as if it's a standalone battery? Certainly operationally they're different, because the battery has to charge from the renewable device to meet the ITC requirements. I'm making that very generic and high level. I know that there is subtleties about that and reductions in ITC, et cetera. I'm not going to go into all the details on that one, but so the question has come up, do they need to be treated differently for the accounting purposes of this? And my first inclination on this is no. From an accounting mechanism, I think they can be treated as if they're separate resources. The operation may be a different story, but that's just my first guess at this. I do think that we need to have some further discussions on these types of things to be able to really get to the bottom of that through some workshops. So that is, well, really, there's 5 bullets here, but it was really 6 items by the time I got done with it. And then there's some other issues that I think need to be included for consideration in any of these. I mentioned earlier what is the planning reserve margin? That's the last bullet that's in there. The load forecast process. How do we go about that? Certainly in this proposal, if folks recall, this moves from a top down to a bottom up, which means that the load forecast process is most definitely different. But in general, even if you stay with a top-down, there's still questions about the load forecast. Do we need to change from a 1 and 2 to a different standard, or is including that uncertainty in the planning reserve margin sufficient? Within this proposal, certainly the application to local RA, NQC and NQE for local RA, what does it mean and how does it work? And what about flex resource adequacy? Is that still necessary under this structure, or is it replaced by this because we're measuring energy, and as long as we're measuring energy, things are okay? I'm asking that as a question, not making it as a statement. And then, as I mentioned, the PRM, and if we are moving to a UCAP methodology where we're taking the forced outages out of the PRM, what does that look like to the new planning reserve margin with all of the other uncertainties? So I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of ways to handle uncertainty, either as a planning reserve margin or by a more conservative approach to the individual elements, like a more conservative load forecast, a more conservative view on what the NQC of the resource is to account for forced outages, those types of things. So I think all of those are discussion points. I think they're all things that we need to think through in all of these proposals. And that's what I would suggest that we start doing as kind of regular workshops to be able to get through this, not only on the SCE CalCCA proposal, but on all of the others as well. Where are the issues with those other proposals? And they won't be the same as this listing. They will be different things. But I think that we do need to work through those to figure out how we move forward on all of these. So as I said, there's a lot packed into this last slide, and I think there probably will be a lot of question and answer to it. I will stop there because I think there's one more piece before we go into Q&A, if I'm not mistaken.
Great. So thanks, Eric. So we're going to have Awea present now.
Hi, Jamie. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can. Hi, Brian.
Thank you. So this is Brian Beering. I'm with the law firm Ellison Schneider, and I am presenting today on behalf of the American Wind Energy Association of California. Our presentation is focused on Edison and CalCCA's proposal, which we see as a very thoughtful proposal that provides a lot of opportunity to really improve some of the existing contract structures that are out there, particularly in light of the growing capacity need in California. Next slide, please. Or actually, sorry, stay there. So go back one, thank you. So Awea California is a broad-based organization of utility-scale renewable energy developers. Our membership includes utility-scale solar developers, solar and storage developers, wind developers that include both out-of-state wind developers in places like New Mexico and Wyoming, as well as offshore wind developers as well. Our policy priorities in California, really in this proceeding, really kind of come to a head, I think, in Edison and CalCCA's proposal. We believe there should be a durable RA structure that provides confidence to both buyers and sellers that the capacity that they are procuring, will count the same now as it will, 10 years from now. We want to make sure that capacity is appropriately valued, and we don't see the current RPS and ELCC structure as really doing that. And finally, we see a lot of value in collaboration with neighboring balancing authorities to facilitate a broader market for energy and capacity. Next slide, please. So there are a number of issues that we see right now with the valuation of clean capacity. The RA program obviously is addressing this in sort of the blue sky phase, and so we're very excited to be participating in this phase. The IRP proceeding has identified a huge need for capacity between now and 2030, approximately 25 to 37 gigawatts of incremental capacity. And then the RPS has accelerated with the adoption of SB 100 and the requirement for long-term contracting. There's really a need, we believe, for relooking at how clean capacity is accounted for to ensure that as we ramp up procurement, we're doing so thoughtfully, and we're doing so in a way that ensures that we're going to basically minimize ratepayer costs with doing so and buying the best capacity that makes the most sense going forward. So we see this in a couple of areas. The net qualifying capacity of renewables is probably the first and foremost. The ELCC, which we'll be talking about on day 2, we believe really needs to be revised. And we'll be talking about that on day 2. Contracting structures for RPS resources, historically, as Michelle was noting earlier, has been a must-take. We've called them essentially a bean counting exercise in the RPS, where there's no incentive for load serving entities and scheduling coordinators and grid operators to essentially hold back capacity to make better use of that capacity. And there's a lot of opportunity to make better use of that capacity. Recently, the CAISO just completed a study with Avangrid Renewables that basically concluded that renewable resources like wind resources, and this is following on a similar study that First Solar did, can provide a lot of different grid services, reg up, reg down, voltage support, and that by using smart inverters, they really can unlock some of these ancillary services and make them available to the grid operators. The problem is that the contracts, the must-take contracts, don't really provide a structure to do that, and really don't provide much valuation of the capacity value of these resources, or the potential capacity value of these resources. The final issue I'll flag with, the valuation of resources is really in the deliverability status of resources. The CAISO's, recently concluded that basically every interconnection request, at least when it's initially filed, has been for full capacity deliverability status. And in our experience, that requirement and the need to show deliverability during peak hours and account for transmission needs really has been a barrier to development. There's been delays in transmission development. There are concerns with cost of transmission development. And so when we looked at CalCCA and Edison's proposal, we really saw an opportunity to potentially change some of that and address a lot of these issues, provide a better structure for contracting clean capacity going forward. Next slide. Okay. So we see this as a very thoughtful proposal. As I mentioned, the current RPS contracts focus on maximizing production, and the structure is resulting in a growing amount of curtailment. I think it won't come as any surprise to all of you that year in, year out, we're seeing more and more curtailment every year, and this is a concern. In addition, in the IRP proceeding, a lot of the capacity that they're studying from solar and wind resources, they're looking at as energy only. The problem is that there's not really a contract structure for energy only. No buyers are really looking for energy only resources. The contracts typically require full capacity deliverability status. Next slide. So one of the issues that's identified in the Edison CalCCA proposal is whether the concept, they basically would require all resources that are netted, wind and solar resources that are netted from the calculation to be, quote, fully deliverable. And there's a footnote that basically says that restricting the deliverability study to one set of conditions is unlikely to produce an outcome that is consistent with the reliability contribution of all resources to the grid. So when we thought about this, and when we've been discussing this with Eric and others, we really see an opportunity with the CalCCA Edison proposal to rethink deliverability. And we believe there's already some existing provisions and processes in place to enable that fairly quickly, given the scale of development that's needed in the near term. Next slide, please. So the mechanism was recently adopted by the CAISO. It's the off-peak deliverability status, and it, at least our understanding is that it hasn't been utilized yet. And the CAISO basically made clear that it wasn't being used for RA, but we think it could be used for RA. So the idea here is that you would be developing a methodology to address renewable energy delivery during hours outside summer peak load period to ensure some minimum level of protection from otherwise potentially unlimited curtailment. And that really is a risk that we're seeing in project development, is how to allocate that risk of curtailment. And we think that by developing a structure that accounts for deliverability in the off-peak hours and then essentially accounts for that in the context of the net qualified energy calculation, that would be a way to essentially minimize transmission costs, minimize the costs of the renewable build-out, and at the same time maximize the availability of that energy during off-peak periods when it's actually available. Next slide, please. So these are actual figures from the CAISO's this year's OPDS modeling, and basically what it's showing is the production duration curves that were evaluated in 2020, and basically showing that 90% of annual energy was selected to set the outputs, and then concludes that at that level, 68% of installed solar capacity, that's the column on the left, and 44% of wind basically could be deliverable in that period. So there's already, next slide, please. So basically, there's already work that has been done to really account for the benefit of off-peak deliverability status. And we think that that is not only important and needs to be reflected in the context of RPS contracting and RA contracting, and also provides an opportunity to really refine that footnote in the Edison-Cal CCA proposal about what is deliverability. So our recommendations for further refinement of the Edison-Cal CCA proposal would be to focus on what should be netted from the LSC's peak load calculation. We believe dispatchable resources such as hybrids shouldn't be netted. We also think that we should be reevaluating how deliverability is accounted for and allow netting of energy-only off-peak deliverability status resources. And then finally, along this notion of ensuring that we can optimize the RPS and RA value, we'd like to keep thinking about how to provide headroom in these contracts and essentially incentivize the provision of ancillary services to grid operators. So we look forward to continuing to work with Edison, Cal CCA, and other parties in this proceeding on this, and appreciate the opportunity to make this presentation.
All right, thank you, Brian. I guess before we open it up to questions, Simone, do you want to give us how many questions do we have?
I just see a few, just 3 so far.
Well, I was gonna ask if Eric had any response that he wanted to speak to Brian's presentation on the issues Brian brought up.
Yeah, so again, legitimate issues that we should be discussing in some working groups. I think that the concern here is that we've got this resource that we're going to be netting off of load, and so the question is, what is the deliverability of that resource during the hours that you're netting it? And that's not necessarily the full capacity deliverability study, which is really looking at peak needs. But it may also not be the strictly off-peak deliverability study either. So I think that we do need to have some discussions. I think the ISO needs to be involved in that since they're the ones who do the deliverability studies. Because conceptually what we're trying to get to is how much can you count on reducing your load by from these renewable resources, wind and solar, when they're generating. And so I do think that we need to get to that. The last part about being able to provide ancillary services, I agree that they can. I don't see that there's necessarily a problem with that. The ISO's must offer obligation can be met by providing energy or ancillary services. So I think it can meet its RA obligation through either of those. I think that question really comes down more to the contractual provisions that people have and the needs that they're buying for. I think up to this point in time, the primary need that people have been buying for is to meet RPS requirements, which means that they need the meter spin. Regardless of whether they're consuming the energy, they need the meter spin. So there's still going to be RPS laws out there that are going to dictate that that is going to be somewhat of a driver. There are going to be other times where the RPS need isn't necessarily there and we can utilize those resources for something different. There will be an evolution of that. If we're going to move to a grid that is composed completely of resources that are non-emitting, unless we can find one of those resources that is available in any hour and completely dispatchable, we're going to have to figure out how to utilize these resources and curtail them at times to be able to use their upward potential for ancillary services to provide those types of services. So no real disagreement here. Again, this is another one of the elements that you would add to the 6 elements that I discussed earlier as to what we need to work through in working groups and workshops. I think this is a 7th, no doubt about it.
Okay, great. Simone, do you want to read through the questions that we have gotten?
Sure. Okay, we have a few from Peter Griffiths. First, how does the SCE CalCCA proposal address the tie between capacity and energy markets? And how does this proposal address assuring energy shows up when it's needed?
Yeah, Peter, thanks. So it's not really trying to get to the concerns that were expressed earlier about whether or not this is going to end up in an exercise of energy market power. And we can talk about the other proposals and whether or not they actually do it. I have some opinions on those. This is really designed to replace the RA structure, and the must-offer obligation would still be the same. We're not suggesting that anybody has to buy an energy product. They're buying the right to count an energy product that has a must-offer obligation such that the energy from it can be realized by the ISO in meeting the market's needs. But primarily, you would still be dispatching these resources through an energy market according to the economics of those resources. Just real quick, the difficulty that I have with some of the other proposals and whether or not they really get at market power mitigation is the following. While I do understand that tolling arrangements can indeed take care of that problem, the difficulty is that they worked very well in the past because they were primarily entered into by the state's 3 IOUs who were under a least cost dispatch protocol with the PUC. Once you start asking for all sorts of load serving entities that are not under those types of regulations with the PUC to sign tolling arrangements, they become the ones who have the incentive in the marketplace. And if you are long on energy, just think of a simple example. I have a 100 megawatt need and I've got 200 megawatts of energy. The higher the market clears, the better off I am, even though my load is going to be served at that higher price, because I'm also going to get that money for both the resource that's providing to my load and the excess 100 megawatts that's not providing to my load. So I'm not sure that you really take care of the market power concerns by turning it over to the load serving entities. And then the other proposal out there that tries to address this is the idea of an energy product where you're buying energy hedges. The difficulty that I have with that one is it's effectively it's a call option contract in which it's liquidated damages, and we've gone through that in California before, where we allowed liquidated damage contracts to be able to count for resource adequacy. And the problem that they started discovering was that there were entities that didn't provide the energy and simply paid whatever the market price was, and you know that the hope would be that it doesn't go that high. But if you think about it in reality, if you look back at the August conditions that we just had, prices in the California marketplace were just over $1,000 when you considered congestion and parameter pricing. We had WEC markets through trading hubs that were clearing at $1,750. So if you're providing a liquidated damage provision, at that point, it is cheaper for you to simply buy the energy out of the ISO's market at $1,500 than it is to buy it at $1,750 and provide it to the participant in the state of California. So I'm not sure that the liquidated damage contract provision ultimately gets the PUC where they wanted to be, which was ensuring that the capacity existed and could be dispatched to provide energy and avoid rotating outages like we just had. So I think we need to consider those types of things as we go through these discussions about market power mitigation and really question whether or not there is any resource adequacy structure that is feasible presently with the set of regulations that the PUC has available to it for all of the load serving entities that will actually get you to energy market power mitigation. Because I've thought through it quite a bit. I'm not sure that there is. But it's worthy of discussion, but hopefully, Peter, that answers your question.
Hey, Eric, this is Michelle Keto. So you're saying that wind and solar would count against the net peak, but what if the net peak moves after dark? Would that devalue the solar? That's one question. And secondly, what if it doesn't, but the solar, the sun's not shining? Don't we still have the same issue that we have now?
Yeah, so let me go about those backwards. So the sun not shining issue really becomes an added item of uncertainty, right? So if you're netting off the expected wind and solar, the question is, what is the expected wind and solar? Are you netting off the production that you would expect to see if it was bright and sunny and the wind was blowing at the velocity that maximizes wind production? Are you using some historical number? Are you using a historical number that is weighted towards a bad condition? Are you weighting it towards a really bad condition? All items of uncertainty. We've kind of had to do the same thing when it comes to capacity. We use an ELCC methodology that helps us a little bit with that. And for hydro, we've used a historic look and weighting that towards kind of bad years as well to figure out the amount of capacity. So I think we have to go through the same discussion as to how are we going to evaluate the expected energy output from those wind and solar resources to give us the level of reliability that we're looking for. And again, to me, that becomes loss of load expectation studies to really understand where we're going to place that forecast. No different than we place the forecast for the amount of load, quite frankly. And then, sorry, your other question was?
If net peak moves after dark, I mean, I would imagine you're signing contracts here, but the amount that occurs is going to change over time, right?
Yeah, so the netting is coming off of your gross load, right? So if you're basically what you're saying is I've signed so many wind and solar resources that I still have a really high net load that happens after dark. And at that point, buying more solar resources isn't doing anything to reduce the amount of RA that I otherwise have to procure because I'm looking at my net load need. It's providing more energy, but honestly, it's only providing that more energy if I have battery storage in my portfolio to be able to move it to a different period of time.
Okay, I have one comment, one more question. So one comment is, so just so I understand that this is really a question of trying to address the question of, are we over relying on use limitations, and also to try to address the question of leaning, is that right?
Yeah, I think that from a high level viewpoint, that's correct.
Okay, but this doesn't really, I mean, you kind of said so, this doesn't really address the issue of market power, right?
No, and that's where I say I'm not sure that any RA structure realistically can.
Yeah, and I guess
we can have debates about that.
Yeah, and I guess I agree with you, but still, to me, in terms of like assessing the energy market, while maybe the RA structure can't do it, it seems to me that we have to keep the eye on the eye on this, because to me, it's like one of the more important issues that we're addressing. Okay, now my question: how would you treat imports? I mean, because imports could be backed by hydro, they could be backed by gas. In addition, they could use opportunity cost bidding and bid at 1,000 and never provide. So that could be a problem.
Yeah, so we didn't assume anything about imports differently than what the PUC is already doing in terms of mandating that they are firm energy contracts and that you get to count them in the hours in which you have the import contract for them. We can contemplate whether or not that's something different. I think for imports, largely, they are still contractually based. I've done a deal for an import at a given price during a certain set of hours, and I have access to that during those hours. There are some varieties to those, but I think that's still by and large is the type of resources that people are bringing in. So we hadn't anticipated that those rules would necessarily change because I know we've already been through the issues about imports and whether or not they can be relied upon, et cetera. So we're assuming that whatever the PUC has already decided to give you comfort that the imports were actually going to deliver, which was the most recent rule on it's a firm energy product that can bid no higher than 0 during certain hours, that took care of the problem, and anticipate that would be the same rule within this process as well.
Eric, this is Jamie. I have just one follow-up question on, I guess, what Peter had mentioned. And this is just a what if. Have you thought about calculating NQE based upon historical production so that you tie the incentive for that resource to maximize its production during the net load peak, or during under the net load duration curve? So you're essentially aligning the incentive with the value stream, and then, if they're not producing because they potentially are exerting market power or whatever, they're just staying out of the money, then you are incentivizing them to produce as much as they can, because then they get a higher NQE in the future.
Yeah, so you could. There's been discussion about that in battery space as well, and here's the general problem that I have with that. When you start looking at historical, what you're doing is talking about when prices have been sufficient for somebody to react in history, which may or may not reflect what's going to happen in the future. So if the prices are such that this resource never operates because it's not economic, but the next year the prices are in a position where it's going to operate all of the time, derating it because it was an abnormal year last year producing very low prices is saying that I don't expect it to have a future RA value because I always expect the conditions to be very mild, which is not necessarily true. So I have problems with tying things to history when that history is dependent upon the economic outcomes. The spaces where that has been somewhat okay is in spaces of forced outage rates, because the forced outage rate is not really tied to prices. It's really tied to whether or not the resource is capable of running. Because it has to submit an outage even if it's not economic for the resource to run anyhow. But when we start moving that over to looking at, well, it didn't operate because prices were below its marginal cost, so therefore next year I'm going to count it for less, doesn't seem to be a rational decision to make because I don't know what prices next year are going to look like.
Okay. Our next question is from Tom Beach. Would SCE and CalCCA be willing to consider changing the definition of storage RA from megawatts for a 4-hour duration to megawatt hours of stored energy and maximum megawatts of discharge in order to provide resources with storage with more flexibility to supply RA?
So the reason that the original proposal on this stuck with the 4-hour duration was really centered around the ISO's concerns about being able to effectively dispatch the resource, and this has been a long-held issue. If I have a battery that is really only available for capacity for 1 hour, my ability to utilize that on peak is severely diminished because I've got to forecast exactly which hour that's going to occur in. If I have the dispatch of that battery for 4 hours, the probability that I hit the peak hour is really pretty good. We weren't proposing to change it because of that operational factor that the ISO has long held. If the ISO believes that they can move away from that they've got enough certainty that they can effectively dispatch the resource in the right hour, I think we could consider moving away from it, but I haven't heard that concern has gone away. I think the ISO has really still stuck with the resource needs to be available for 4 consecutive hours, or else they don't have the confidence that they can dispatch the resource appropriately.
Mary Neal, why does your proposal net wind and solar from load and not generation from other resource types such as hydro, geothermal, or nuclear?
It's dispatchability. So the wind and solar is generally going to produce when the wind is available and the sun is shining. Hydro facilities, on the other hand, can be dispatched. The nuclear resources are generally going to operate as long as they're not on a refueling outage. I suppose you could do the same thing for nuclear if you really wanted to. I don't know how beneficial that is, quite frankly. There's a relatively small amount of nuclear right now that's going to get even smaller in the not too distant future. I know that a lot of the geothermal is kind of base load, but I do know that some of it can indeed dispatch. So the line that we were drawing was that it was primarily the wind and solar resources that were creating the net load peak concerns of moving the net load to a later hour. When you really look at something that's base loaded and it's taking load off of every single hour, all it does is it shifts the entire load curve down and doesn't change the hour in which the net peak occurs. It just moves the entire thing down, as to where wind and solar that operates in specific hours can actually change the hour in which the net peak load occurs.
She has another question. Is there any consideration in this proposal for a storage resource that could store energy in 1 month for delivery in another month? And how would that work?
So you're pretty much talking pump storage hydro at that point. There's not a lot of current battery technology that is chemical based that really does that. I know that there's talk of it out there. Not really, and the main reason for that is that the limited amount of that actually exists right now, and the opportunity cost month to month really doesn't present as much of a problem on the grid for those resources presently. I think that there's enough opportunity cost day to day, day in and day out, that problem largely resolves itself. Is it a theoretical problem? I suppose so. I just don't know with everything else that has to be solved that's another element that we want to throw in this at this point, given the relatively small magnitude compared to everything else.
Dariusz, you should be unmuted if you want to ask your questions.
Hi, Eric. This is Dariusz. A couple of points. We actually had 3 points. Fortunately, you had one of our points covered as part of your presentation. Thank you for that. I had 2 other points that I wanted to, Calvia had 2 other points that I wanted to raise. First one is related to deliverability and the fact that there is a need to involve CAISO in such a proposal to make sure that deliverability reforms are instituted at CAISO in order to be able to make this proposal work, which we generally support. So that was our second point, which I think you have addressed in general. And if you have additional points to make around that, we appreciate that. The last point we want to make, and for this we would like to get your comments, and that is in determining RA capacity after all is said and done, and these RA capacity would come from controllable resources per se. You have suggested that we do bottom up per LSC and add them up, and as you can imagine, and as that will end up calculating a bigger RA capacity that we ever need. So we were wondering if, for determination of the need for RA capacity, we could do top to bottom approach, and then when it comes to distributing that requirement among LSCs, to go a bottom-up approach and use the bottom-up numbers as allocators. If you have a comment on that, we would appreciate that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, Dariusz, thank you. So that is one that Edison had mentioned earlier and didn't actually include in this proposal. I think because we largely consider that to be part of the overall planning reserve margin consideration. And we have noted when we presented this originally and put it in the proposal that when you go from a top down to a bottoms up, you go from a coincident peak to a non-coincident peak, and it's the sum of the non-coincident peaks, which in all but the most bizarre circumstances is going to be greater than the coincident peak. And so you'll end up with an over procurement of RA resources when you do that is really not beneficial to customers because they're paying more for reliability than what you expect to actually need. So there has to be a process to take those non-coincident net load peaks and move that back to whatever the coincident net load peak is, such that you're not buying excess resources. What that methodology is, we haven't opined on yet, but we think is part of the planning reserve margin study process to figure out exactly how to do it. It could be, as you just described, that we use the coincident peak to establish that and then move it into a non-coincident bottoms-up approach in some way, shape, or form. I do think that is a topic for discussion within this process, within workshops, and again, I view that as being part of the planning reserve margin discussion to figure out exactly how to get there. So no disagreement with you, that is another discussion point that we need to have. As far as the deliverability, so certainly I agree with you. We've got to figure out, are the current planning study processes sufficient? And when I say sufficient, it could be, as I mentioned, you're really looking for what the deliverability of that resource is in all of the hours that it's going to generate as a renewable resource. So we have the on-peak, the full capacity deliverability. We have the off-peak deliverability. And if it works out to where those encompass all 24 hours and you can partition it out, you might be able to look at and evaluate what kind of energy you could get from resources in all 24 hours and utilize the existing methodologies just split up into those categories. It's also possible that you need to do an entirely new study that is able to account for all 24 hours to be able to do this. Which methodology we use, right now I'm indifferent to, because I'm not at the point of trying to figure out what the implementable solution is. I'm at the point of trying to figure out whether or not it can be solved. And in my opinion, that is a piece that certainly can be solved. It's going to require some discussion as to how we do it. It may even require new methodologies. But nonetheless, I don't see that as being an immovable object to be able to get there. But you are correct. That is something that we think needs to be discussed throughout the workshops.
Thanks, Rick.
Sure.
Simone, is there any more questions in the chat?
Nope, that's it.
Okay. Eric, I have one question. I'm not sure how far you went into it already. Apologies if you did, but I don't recall hearing it. Has Edison and CalCCA began talking with the CEC about how we could get individual load forecasts by LSE to arrive at the NQE requirements?
So very early on in this process, before it was a joint proposal, Edison actually did reach out to the CEC and talked with Lynn and had a discussion about it. What I recall as the outcome of that was, yes, it's possible. It is very much a different process from what we do today. It will take a different number of assets to be able to get through it than what we have today. And it will take a different process to be able to get through than what we have today. Interestingly enough, CERT had a meeting yesterday in which they asked me to speak on this, and a kind of a similar question came up from a CEC personnel on that one with very much the same type of answer. Yeah, it's most definitely a different process. There's no doubt about that. And so I think this is one where, if this is one of the things that we want to do, we, one, need to confirm that it's not a showstopper. Is this something that the CEC could do? And then two, as we work it to an implementable solution, that we make sure that there is enough cross-agency work on this to ensure that the CEC understands what we're trying to accomplish, and the CEC is involved in that process to make sure that the load forecast gets us there.
And I just want to clarify too, is Edison and CalCCA's proposal to have both frameworks, an NQC framework for peak as well as an NQE for energy, and so having both for a unforeseeable, future, like into the future, or just until a certain time frame and transitioning just to an NQE structure? And I think about it just because, with an NQC structure, we already have so many complicated layers, and adding another structure to that, an NQE structure, and having those same kind of complicated layers, and resources to implement the programs. I just wanted to kind of get clarity around your thinking of that.
Yeah, and certainly Stephanie can weigh in too if she has a different view on it. But my view is that we have the complexity that we have today because those two layers actually already exist. We already have a peak need, and we have MCC buckets, which are really trying to account for energy, right? So we've got the complexity already there. It hasn't been much of an issue to this point in time because the contractual structures have been able to take care of the problem. But as we move forward and it's not the contractual structure, but the characteristics of the resource that begin taking over, that MCC structure was beginning to show some weaknesses, and its ability to make sure that you had not only the peak load, but you had the load in every other hour is diminishing fairly rapidly. So in my view, it's not really that we are adding complexity to it. We're addressing complexity that is coming up in the current structure that the current structure is probably not capable of addressing. Does it make it more complex? Certainly, but I think it makes it more complex because of the nature of the resources that we have and what it's doing to the nature of the load service on the grid that the ISO is seeing, and how they are capable of meeting that. So that's what I would say about it. I don't think this is something that we do for a little while and then it goes away, unless we get to the point where the net peak load is flat all year long, and you really don't have to worry about it any longer. You just have to worry about the energy output. But I don't think that we're ever going to get to that point. The truth of the matter is that people's load consumptions change when resources are available change, and it's going to create patterns throughout the day that you have to be able to deal with. So I do think that this is a change to the RA structure that hopefully gets us through, well, at least until I retire, so I don't have to redo it again.
Hey, Eric, this is Michelle. How do you treat DR in terms of its ability to reduce load if you're not looking at historical to see how many hours, and how would you treat some DR programs that dispatch 3 hours and some DR programs that dispatch 80 hours if it's not looking at the historical production or reduction?
Yeah, so Michelle, good question. So I think from a capacity standpoint, it gets treated much the same way that it does today. And I won't prejudge whether that's going to be load impact protocols or some other methodology, but whatever methodology is decided upon to best predict what the ability of that resource to respond during the net peak load needs is what we're going to utilize. The amount of energy, again, this comes down to those use-limited resources and what do we believe about those use-limited resources to predict the amount of NQE. Because not only do we have a resource that the amount of capacity that it would produce in any hour is dependent upon the ambient conditions, how many hours you're actually going to call upon it may change as well, and what those prices are going to change. But from a high level, if you think about it, if you look at the program and say it's a 10 megawatt program and it's available to me for 20 hours, and I do expect that over those 20 hours that I can get the 20 highest load hours, so I'm always going to get 10 megawatts, then it's 10 times 20 and it's 200 megawatt hours. That's what I would expect to get out of energy for that type of a program. Whether or not I dispatch it that much is really dependent upon grid conditions. If we never get to the point where it's necessary to dispatch the DR, then I may not dispatch it that much, but that's true of any resource, quite frankly. A gas-fired resource that's available 24/7 isn't going to operate 24/7 all year long. But nonetheless, their NQE is there because I could indeed use it to meet my needs if I needed to. So I would look at demand response as being very much the same, and then the question is really going to become, is my NQC number a number that is unexpected over some range of the dispatches? And suppose instead of having 20 hours of dispatch, I had 7,000 hours of dispatch. Now I've got to ask myself the question, well, do I really think the load is going to be at the NQC level for all 7,000 of those hours, given that that's the majority of the year, the vast majority of the year?
But imagine that, I'm an LSE and I'm 100 megawatts and I say, I'll drop all 100 megawatts, if the price is right, meet all my needs or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, how do you prevent that sort of gaming?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think it's going to come down to what the must-offer obligation for DR is. And are we utilizing these resources as the last resort? to be able to utilize for those very few peak hours, or are we actually expecting that these things are available in a very much larger number of hours? And then the other question that really comes up is, when we put together utility programs and when we put together DRAM programs, does there need to be some strike price at which they're not allowed to bid above to ensure that we get the value out of those resources? And that I think is a combination of the DR proceedings as well as the RA proceedings to figure out exactly where that lies.
All right, guys, I'm just doing a time check. We're 4 minutes past, so I want to give Green Power Institute some time to present and ask questions on their proposal. So we're going to move on to the next presentation deck. Thank you for presenting, Eric. And I guess if other people have additional questions, you could always reach out to parties offline to take up or get answers that we're not able to discuss today. Hi, Greg.
Hi, do you want me to start?
Yes, can you please start?
Great.
We can hear you.
Yes, thank you. The Green Power Institute proposal is more of an Uber proposal than the other proposals under consideration here. We're not looking to make little changes in how things are counted or treated, but it's looking at the RA program as a whole and trying to recognize that really RA by itself is directed at the transmission distribution aspect of electric utilities rather than being equivalent to energy procurement, for example. And recognizing that RA is a grid-related function, we think that it ought to be put onto the wires utilities, the utilities that operate the grid, rather than sort of breaking it up and making all of the LSCs acquire RA and then supply it to the grid. The wires utilities have us beyond simply a requirement to acquire a certain amount of RA capacity. They actually are the ones who have to use that capacity when we get to the kind of conditions that the grid is stressed, whether it be the afternoon ramp or the peak load. So our proposal is really just about saying that we should make RA procurement a function of the T&D side of the market and assign it only to the T&D utilities. What we're really trying to do here, and this is going right back to Arthur's original presentation that started us off today, simplify the RA market and RA procurement, unburden the non-wires LSEs from the requirement to procure RA, and let the operators of the grid procure the RA and use it. So in a nutshell, that's what our proposal is. We notice that when you break it up into some 40 different agents trying to procure RA, often they're going to have to be joint procurement efforts, because some of them are and now I'm looking at mostly the gas fired providers, but some of them don't even have to have as much RA capacity as one provider has. So you would have to have sort of procurement groups going after RA. We see right now that a lot of the small, especially the smaller LSEs, are filing for waivers. That this is really a burden on these entities. This is our opinion, of course, that I would think, and I'm very much interested in getting feedback on this, that they would just as soon be able to do without. And if it went to the wires utilities, that they could then do RA in a more holistic fashion. And also, because they're the users of the RA services, they have a motivation that goes beyond simply making up certain numbers, and their motivation is to do it in such a way that they can really operate the grid efficiently. It would simplify the commission's job because now you don't have to try and parse the total RA requirement into a huge number of different small entities, but simply apply it to mainly to 3 entities and 3 rather large entities. So in a nutshell, that is our proposal. It goes, well, for example, a lot of what we just heard in the SCE CCA proposal, those issues would simply be now concentrated on fewer entities, requiring that they're still the same issues kind of coming through. So that's why I say our proposal is really very much a structural proposal. In some ways, we're talking about bringing the structure of the RA program back to where it was when it was designed, which was that the IOUs did all the RA procurement. We already have created just recently a structure within the local RA procurement for the IOUs to act as the RA procurement entities. This would simply, in some ways, build on that, and it would also somewhat simplify the way that those services are distributed. So I guess that's my quick introduction. I'd love to have questions. I see that the person in charge of the slides here has focused on the set of questions that I wrote up. So I'd like to throw it open to those.
Okay, Simone, do we have any questions in the Q&A?
We don't have any.
Do you want to maybe read through your questions here and just specifically?
This is Michelle. I thought we did have a question from Eric Little in the Q&A, right?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, go ahead. You go ahead.
But under a proposal in which you would have the IOUs procure all RA from non-renewable resources, how do you propose addressing the GHG attribution that would state that the emissions associated with such resources would be that of the utility's bundled load?
I would not envision that the bundled customers would have to pick up all of the greenhouse gases. That would be distributed, and I don't have a simple answer because I'm not sure exactly how these things are done, but could be the attribution of the greenhouse gas burden would be put out to all utility customers through the T&D charge. The cost would be, and perhaps the same breaking down to the T&D customers would also present a methodology or a sort of approach to how you would break that down so that the emissions are fairly charged to all of the users who are benefiting from it. So it certainly should not be a burden placed only on the bundled customers.
So this is Michelle. I just wanted to make a couple of observations, one of which is that this is what we do for, or what we have historically done with what we call the CAM resources. So when I was speaking earlier, we decided that building new resources was expensive. ESPs largely weren't going to do it because that's not their business model. The utilities didn't really want to do it because they didn't expect to have the load for that long, but we determined that the reliability resources are needed, and we allocated those to all customers. So there is a historical model for doing this. In addition, the commission did adopt a central procurement entity for local resources, which are, arguably a T&D, a reliability asset, sort of similar to transmission. If you had all the transmission in the world, you wouldn't need the local resources. So it's sort of a transmission alternative. So in those two instances, for PG&E and Edison, we did adopt a central procurement model to simplify that. So aspects of your proposal are already in place. Thanks.
Yes, and I think I mentioned that the model there, mechanism is there, and now we're suggesting that instead of just being the local RA, that it be extended to system RA and flexible RA. So, yes, part of this has already started. Now,
I guess the two things that I would add is the impediments I see are, these sit on the utilities balance sheets, and at this point, usually these are just flow through. So they're financing this on behalf of all customers. So there's that issue. In addition, the CCAs have argued pretty vociferously that they want procurement autonomy, and the legislature does have language. So we have to balance all of those. So that was that slide where we showed so many competing needs. So I would just note those two things. Thanks.
And I agree but to me, and I'd love to hear from some CCAs, I think that the CCAs certainly want procurement autonomy for the energy products. The question is, do they also benefit from having some amount of procurement autonomy for RA products, or is that a responsibility that they would be willing to pass on to a central procurement entity?
Has anybody raised their hand?
We have a question. Well, Eric wanted to clarify that he was not talking about costs. It was about the power content label, the attribution for the power content label. And
I understand, and I was just trying to say that the cost distribution gives you a model for how to distribute the power content burden.
And then we have a question from Peter Griffiths. What is the relation between capacity and energy procurement obligations? LSEs for energy and T&D for capacity?
Yes.
And this is Jamie. If CCAs and ESPs are required to build new resources, would they then have to go sell the capacity piece to the utilities? Or would this make it so that the utilities are the only ones procuring new generation or installing new capacity on the system?
Oh, no, I would think that if the CCAs, ESPs support new capacity, they would then have to supply or would want to supply that to the central procurement entity and ought to be, in effect, price takers. So take the price that has already been established by the IOUs.
I see a few hands up. It looks like maybe there are a couple CCAs that would like to speak to this. Maybe we go to Stephanie.
Hi, sorry, having some mic trouble. Yeah, thanks. I want to sort of respond to a couple of these questions. So I do think that in general, CCAs would, would not be comfortable with IOUs procuring on behalf of us for, all of the RA responsibilities. I think, we have considered various potential models for having a central buyer, because we do recognize that, there are, it is a challenging market, but our preference would be to retain the autonomy to procure on our behalf, and potentially have we could have a discussion about whether a central entity to procure residual RA made sense, and what the appropriate entity would be. But I think at least that's where EBC is right now. I don't know if other CCAs would like to speak it.
Okay, and if you're East Bay, of course, you're one of the biggest CCAs. I'm not sure that some of the smaller CCAs would feel as comfortable with having that responsibility, but the way that the central procurement entity has been set up right now is they took the hybrid, of course, model. And I certainly think that could be extended to other forms of RA.
Now, Doug Carpa, would you like to say something? Well, I mean, mute you in 1 sec. There we go.
Yeah, am I off?
Yeah, we can hear you, Doug.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, this is Doug Carper from PCE. I think I was mostly just raising my hand lest we have nobody respond. I would echo what Stephanie had to say about there being some hesitation around handing over the RA products to a central procurement entity. Generally, I do think the point about smaller CCAs or CCAs in different communities are going to give you different answers to those questions. So there's, there would need to be a lot of discussion internally, and there certainly is a certain diversity of opinion, I think, among CCAs about the advisability of a central procurement entity for RA. But as has been pointed out, the procurement autonomy is pretty important because one, that's part of why we exist, and also in a lot of instances, I think a lot of the things that would have to get sorted out too are around what resources are being procured and what the GHG impacts of that are, because a lot of us have, of course, much stronger GHG goals than exist statewide, and so would be questions about the interplay between if you have IOUs go out procuring a bunch of gas, like does that preclude achieving these higher GHG standards that some of us have? And so complicated question, but thank you for asking it.
And I totally agree. I mean, we're an environmental organization. We're very much interested in going beyond the minimal standards for renewable or carbon-free energy. So I totally agree. Also, I want to say that I'm not trying to force this proposal on anybody. I'm trying to provide a proposal that provides benefits for everybody, including simplicity. And I totally agree that what I've presented is certainly subject to input and refinement so that it does provide the needs of all the different kinds of parties.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Yeah, there's a lot to chew on here.
Mm-hmm.
All right, is there a few more, actually first I want to do a time check. We're running into our break and I do see a couple other questions I think that parties might want to talk to this, but I don't want to push us into ending later than 4:30 today. So I would suggest maybe that we forego our break and maybe answer the questions that are in the queue. But if others have additional thoughts, we could take a few minutes, maybe at the end of the questions, and then get going again. Looking for confirmation from somebody.
I'm willing to do whatever makes sense through the group.
Amy, I think we should just take the couple of questions and continue on. It's only a half hour longer. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. All right, I think it's Peter.
Peter, you're on mute. Peter?
In the questions he did ask, doesn't the capacity procured by IOUs determine the available energy for other LSEs to procure?
Yeah, this is Peter Griffiths. I guess my question basically just gets at the capacity available and the characteristics. The capacity procured would determine to some degree the characteristics of the energy that would be available for other LSEs. And so, as I think points have been made by some of the CCA representatives, that may not be the right characteristics that they would be wanting to procure with regard to the energy. So would this set up a situation where there would be excess capacity? Because you'd have the LSEs, or you'd have the IOUs essentially getting to a capacity that meets the RA requirement, and then you would also have then LSEs procuring to get the characteristics of the energy they wanted.
And I certainly see putting the loading order requirements onto the procurement of RA products. Absolutely. I'm not sure I totally understand what you're asking.
So I think Peter's point is with solar and wind, the capacity energy isn't typically unbundled. And so if somebody wants to go buy the energy from a solar or wind facility, they would also sort of implicitly be buying the capacity. So I think that's what Peter's getting at, but I don't think we necessarily need to solve it. I think we get the idea of this, and we're struggling with this issue in other realms as well. Thanks.
Right, and like I said, certainly in a non-wires LSE that has contracted with a solar or wind would be able to provide that RA component to the central procurement entity. And I would hope that they would be given the market price. And that's a simple statement with a lot of complexity behind it. I understand.
Okay, I think we got one more question from Nicholas, or his hand's raised. So we're going to unmute your mic, Nicholas.
Hey, can you hear me?
We sure can.
Hey, thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Greg. This is Nick from CalCCA. I don't want to repeat Doug and Stephanie's comments, but I did just want to comment As you mentioned, Greg, PCE and EBCE are larger CCAs, but I just wanted to note for the record, we're not really seeing a lot of interest even among our smaller members for giving up this segment of their procurement autonomy. One of the issues that's come up in the local capacity procurement is the sort of bifurcation of the procurement responsibility creates a lot of uncertainty and it creates just problems as folks are trying to figure out how much they need to procure for, how much central buyer is doing. And if we think about having the entirety of the RA obligation transition to a central entity such as the IOU, I think it really creates a lot of problems as we move forward into a space where we need to be thinking about a sort of more integrated planning where energy and capacity sort of procuring the same sets of resources, hopefully moving forward to tackle both of these problems. So I just wanted to flag that. I don't want to repeat what's already been said about sort of CCA concerns here, but wanted to flag those for the group.
And I appreciate that and agree.
All right. Well, thank you, Greg, for your presentation, and thanks for all that participated and commented on this topic. We're going to now jump into CISA's presentation on MCC buckets. Lennon, do you have Jen pulled into the panelist?
Yes.
Jen, I'm going to hand the mic over.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. And thanks, RA team, for allowing us to present here today. I thought it's been a really stimulating conversation thus far. So I'm Jen No, I'm with the California Energy Storage Alliance. We're a broad tent membership organization representing the storage ecosystem. So, within our membership, we got, lithium ion, traditional lithium ion companies, but also, different long duration seasonal storage technologies as well, developers behind the meter, in front of the meter. So we're pretty broad, and we took a lot of time over the summer to think through, what can be done to address the scoping memo issues. If you can go to the next slide, and maybe the next slide after that, to think through, based on what the commission has identified as some of the issues in the scoping memo around addressing broader RA reform to address energy attributes and hourly capacity requirements. We also saw, many calls from the ISO about, addressing the net peak needs, not just the gross peak needs, and how we need to evolve our framework to consider energy requirements as well. And so we've had conversations with SCE as well, and definitely support their proposal. And I don't think what we're presenting here is mutually exclusive. I think there could be opportunities to maybe position this proposal as kind of a transition to broader reforms. I think one of the issues that we were trying to think through is how can we address some of these needs in the near term, while flexibly, accounting for energy limitations, use limited resources, and not necessarily being overly restrictive to how they can participate within the RA program. But fully recognizing the problem at hand as outlined in the scoping memo and the preliminary root cause analysis report and the IRP proceeding, et cetera. And so with that in mind, if we go to the next slide, when the Track 2 decision came out back in June, one of the things that they adopted was the revisions to the MCC buckets, using some updated load curves from 2016 to 2018, and making some modifications to how availability is defined. And really the decision, kind of premised or justified a lot of these changes to ensure that any LSCs don't overly rely on use limited resources to meet reliability needs and minimize LSC leaning. And so, at the time when that decision was issued, we had, some disagreements over this MCC proposal. But, after giving it some thought, in consulting with our members as well, we thought the MCC framework could also be utilized to potentially advance portfolio concepts that can address the net peak load needs while also not overly restricting how these resources can actually count toward RA capacity. On the next slide, of course, we had a number of concerns with the way that the MCC buckets were ultimately adopted. We thought it established hard caps on specific technologies, and I think operating within the current RA structure, it also in some ways makes sense to do so. But we thought, given the reliability needs that the ISO seeing on an hour-by-hour basis, and given the fact that the IRP portfolios are really showing that we do need to rely on 4-hour, 8-hour energy storage, all different types of energy limited and use limited resources to meet our decarbonization goals. We wanted to think through a way that we can kind of make the MCC structure a little more flexible and not put too much of an undue emphasis on like the continuous consecutive hour operation of RA resources, yet at the same time still being assured that our reliability objectives are met. And so our proposal is really focused on reframing the MCC paradigm to what I like to think of as kind of setting the ingredients that are needed for each LSE to continue to procure these types of resources, preferred and energy storage resources and hybrid capacity resources, while also still considering the energy requirements and characteristics that are needed, and with a focus on some of the periods with actual reliability risks. Within the RA Enhancements Initiative at the ISO, we're seeing some useful analysis as to what are some of the stress periods, which includes the morning ramp and not just the availability assessment hours, and taking into account all that analysis to kind of set what is the curve for which we need to solve and identify the specific building blocks to fill that curve. And so we think this approach can more flexibly enable different types of preferred and energy storage and hybrid resources that help make up an LSE's portfolio and meet the multi-hour capacity needs by essentially establishing some minimum requirements for the different categories of MCC resources, while also at the same time still leveraging the existing structure in place that reasonably balances and maintains some bilateral transactability and contract financeability. And I raise this because even with the central procurement entity for local RA purposes, it's really challenging to finance and have certainty about RA values and really finance projects around that. If it's really difficult to determine how much RA capacity a resource can reasonably account for. And at the same time, being sure that by leveraging these types of immediate reforms while still leveraging the existing RA constructs, we can continue development of ideas like SCEs and CalCCAs, which many of our members do share the view that it has a lot of promise. I think there's a lot of the issues that Eric mentioned, I think are addressable, at least in my view. And it just requires us putting our heads together to figure some of those things out. But with that said, on the next slide, just as a kind of a summary of what CISA's Track 3B proposal looks like, is we're basically modifying the minimum requirements for each different MCC category so that it more flexibly enables resources to sets minimum requirements for each category that basically fills the area under the net load curve, that accounts for certain critical periods in which we could potentially set availability assessment hours, while still being able to flexibly allow for RA resources to participate in the energy market and deliver the capacity as the economic conditions dictate. And so across category 2, category 3, we're not necessarily limiting it to consecutive hours of discharge in the case of energy storage, but allowing for non-consecutive hours to still be able to address the broader energy needs, but doing it in a more flexible way. And so it could still involve resources that can meet, for example, the 8 consecutive hour requirement, but also allows for resources that can deliver beyond that to provide energy during non-consecutive hours over an 8-hour period. And so I think the specific availability requirements and percentages can be calculated. It's going to really be dependent on the specific net load peak curve that's being accounted for. And we can conduct the analysis on an annual basis or biannual basis to update these percentages. But we're hoping that this type of framework that sets, what are the core ingredients in which LSEs need to build their portfolio to meet broader system RA needs, it will guide them in, not necessarily being limited to energy storage resources that meet these 4 consecutive hour requirements, but can also enable resources that cycle twice a day or are able to, cycle in non-consecutive hours, and resources that are longer duration, that are 8 hours, that can actually meet, for example, the category 2 requirements, moving away from the 4-hour duration rule to allow for 8-hour resources to fully count for their capacity, so long as they meet the category's minimum requirements. And so on the next slide, we discuss how this could potentially be done. I think we make a number of modifications to the DR bucket. I think a lot of the same questions to SCE's proposal around how we net out variable generation is also a question that's apt here, and we kind of adopted a similar type of framework because of many of the same questions around the ISO and CPUC, highlighting how we need to address net peak needs, not gross peak needs. And then on the next slide, in the interest of time, some of the potential benefits that we see in this proposal is that there is some near-term applicability. I think a lot of the existing RA structures can be leveraged in the near term. It could present a potential bridge to develop more of the fundamental revisions to the NQE proposal. Transactability and financeability of RA contracts are maintained. I think a lot of the issues around, how do we address the hour-by-hour system reliability needs? I think this can be enabled by setting these minimum requirements, enabling this type of block stacking to develop a portfolio of assets to address longer energy needs. And also being flexible to incorporate energy storage in their intended operations. So there could be resources that cycle twice a day. There could be resources that maybe 4 hours, but can derate their capacity to fulfill longer energy needs, et cetera. On the next slide, other benefits that we see is it could potentially incentivize the procurement of diverse resources. One of the challenges that we see for longer duration resources is they're not being necessarily accounted for their full value because everything is kind of boiled down to the 4-hour duration rule. And so we're hoping, this type of proposal, so long as they meet the minimum requirements of that category, they can count for the full capacity for 8 hours of discharge. But at the same time, it still enables LSEs who want to build a portfolio of 4-hour resources to be able to do so as well, so long as they fit within each of the categories. And I think it also, by setting the variable generation as netting out of the need, I think some of the restrictions on VERS in Category 4 are also eliminated. So we can continue to advance their procurement. And then lastly, I think that this type of framework could potentially enable multi-use applications. So resources that have certain minimum commitments and requirements per the MCC category, they can potentially service that minimum requirement, but then also be able to provide services in other hours. And so this enables resources to not necessarily be fully committed to a specific like only an RA purpose, but also enables resources to provide deferral or customer sided services for behind the meter resources as well. And then lastly, just areas of feedback that I definitely wanted to solicit from workshop participants here is, I think there are a number of questions that still need to be resolved. This is just a concept, and based on the feedback that we receive here, we can kind of go back and finalize a proposal. But there are questions about transition. How does this impact near-term procurement needs? How would these MCC, how would this impact RA resources if MCC percentages are updated to reflect new load curves? How does interact with the 4-hour rule for resources that are procured, are already existing and procured as such? Could this potentially be applied to local RA? I know we have a local RA structure in place, and how much it actually counts for local RA is going to depend on these effectiveness factors. But could we potentially position something like this, even though it's more simplistic in nature and doesn't account for locational effectiveness or whatnot? Could this potentially be adopted there and account for any potential extreme reliability concerns or inaccuracies through changing kind of the underlying assumptions of that net load peak curve for that local area, potentially by adjusting the planning reserve margin, for example. And then transactability, how will this work if we do have both system and local RA using this approach? If we have different percentages, different availability requirements, how will that be impacted? And then, of course, other questions, happy to answer them as well.
All right. Does anybody have their hand up, Simone, or questions in the chat?
We have one question from Carl. What is the basis of need for 2-hour DR products, and how does that mesh with what we just heard from SCE about the need for 4-hour duration?
Yeah, I think the 2-hour duration, we were trying to make it similar to how other ISO and RTO markets kind of qualify demand response for capacity purposes. I mean, I think it could be 2 hours, it could be 4 hours. I've been kind of looking at how other DR programs kind of set their requirements to potentially set that. And attempting to try to distinguish, traditional demand response with, behind the meter battery storage that could potentially, qualify for more amount of RA to be provided. I think that can all be subject to discussion and change, but I think that the core structure is we want to set these minimum requirements, and if it's 4 hours, if it's 2 hours, we can discuss that.
Was there anybody else, Simone?
I don't see anyone else.
All right. I guess I have a question, Jen. I know we have just a few minutes left before we got to get to Connect's presentation, but what can, going back to kind of what Eric Little had said in the beginning about, kind of bucketing these proposals in terms of implementing shorter term fixes and then longer term structural changes. Do you see this as being an implementable proposal for 2022?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think it necessarily requires, too much change. I know at the beginning when Michelle was going over a lot of the other issues around market power, how do we ensure that energy is delivered? I think a lot of those, it's not entirely clear that that should necessarily be resolved within the RA program. I mean, that could be an ISO market product, like an energy shifting product, or it could be resolved contractually. And I think, notwithstanding all those complicated issues, I think we're just basically trying to modify the MCC categories and the definitions and the minimum requirements, while otherwise not really changing the RA structure. So I think it's implementable in my view.
All right. Well, thank you. And I know that the Q&A was rather short, but if others do have questions for Jen, I encourage you to reach out outside of this workshop and ask him about his proposal or thesis proposal.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. All right. So Linon, do we have Connect pulled in?
Hi, yes, this is Maria. Can you hear me?
Hi, Maria. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present. Hopefully this can be very quick. I know this is the end of the day, and I'm presenting on behalf of LEAP and the California Efficiency and Demand Management Council. So this proposal is probably a bit smaller in scope than some of the others that we've heard today. It relates to the DR bucket specifically. And even though it's small, I would just say that this is important to demand response industry. So I'm just stating that outright. And of course, if there are changes that are made that are larger to the RA program, this proposal would have to be considered within the scope of those broader changes in how the MCC buckets look. Obviously, it may make this proposal fit or not fit within the broader scope. But if we continue with the RA program as it is today and the MCC DR buckets as they stand today, we would like to discuss these proposed changes. So first, a few concerns with the 8.3% DR bucket cap that was implemented in the last RA decision. So first of all, the effective cap as we're seeing it is lower than 8.3%. So the decision that was adopted stated that the 8.3% cap allows for a approximate doubling of the demand response market relative to current levels when the PRM is applied, and that would present something like 3,700, a bit over 3,700 megawatts. And while that's absolutely true at the system level, that's when you take 8.3% of the peak need and apply the PRM. The cap is not implemented at the system level. It's implemented at the level of each LSC. And of course, not every LSC procures DR. If they don't, that headroom, their portion of their 8.3% is effectively lost. Another LSC cannot procure some portion of another LSC's headroom. So if you have several LSCs doing this, of course, which they are likely to do, based on preferences, price tolerances, etc., you're going to find a market where the effective cap is necessarily always going to be lower than 8.3%. And the reason I say this is that we, this past procurement cycle, have encountered quite a few LSCs hitting their cap. And I will note that this is public information, this is a market with just two major market players. There were three of us that were approved via VLIPs to sell RA capacity outside of the DRAM, two with any substantial amount of megawatts. And if two market players are seeing LSCs hit the cap, one just has to wonder what market exists for additional market players being approved for even greater amount of capacity. So that is the first problem, is the effective cap is actually lower than 8.3%, and we're seeing it really in market transactions. The cap also uniquely prejudices third-party demand response. The majority of demand response resources currently providing RA, probably about 3/4, are IOU-DR programs. And IOU-DR is a must-take resource. Currently, it's allocated first to LSC, so it fills the bucket first, And then third-party demand response can be procured on top of that up to 8.3%. So because it's IOUDR so large compared to third-party programs currently, they are effectively crowding out third-party demand response, especially for small entities, small LSCs, where 8.3% is really a small part of their total obligation. When you discount the space that's taken up by IOUDR, the remainder is just so small that it's probably not worth their administrative costs or the DRP's administrative costs to execute contracts. And in general, this concern is probably one that worries us most above all else, is the preferential treatment of IOUDR over third party in this context is in direct contradiction to decision 1609-056, which states that, and you can read, demand should be market driven with a preference for services provided for third parties through performance-based contracts at competitively determined prices. So I will say a caveat here is, of course, we don't imagine that DRPs must necessarily always sign contracts for all of their approved capacity. If there is not willing buyers for their product, they do not sign contracts, and that's how competitive markets work, and that's completely fine. Where we see an issue is if willing buyers do exist, but cannot procure the product because of a cap. And again, this is happening with really two market players that are approved for a relatively small amount of capacity. Next slide, please. And finally, the cap raises unnecessary barriers to the deployment of additional demand response, as we saw in the root cause analysis. One of the recommendations was that the agency should expedite the regulatory and procurement processes to develop additional resources that can be online by 2021, with a focus on demand-side resources such as demand response. Given that the current levels of demand response represent a market where there is no cap, and 2021 will be capped, we could potentially see a market where demand response providing RA capacity in 2021 is actually lower than it is today. And it also presents kind of a lack of incentive for DRPs to develop additional resources. And it discourages new market participants, again, if you have two large players, or relatively large, I guess, encountering these problems where LSCs are at their cap. You wonder, as a new market entrant, if it's worth your time. Next slide, please. So we have three proposals to deal with this issue. They're not mutually exclusive. One, two, or three of them can be considered together. First is to truly kind of meet the spirit of the decision that 8.3% cap represents approximately a doubling of of available market for DR. We should apply the cap at the system level only. Obviously, you can't actually apply the cap at the system level. Tracking becomes very burdensome. But effectively, the way that you could implement this is to uncap DR procurement at the LSC level until the total approved DR quantity, which again is known, it's public information, reaches the 8.3% threshold. So we know that the current volumes of approved DR are below 8.3%. The decision recognizes this. So it seems that, at least at the system level, there does not appear to be reliability concerns. So even if third-party DRPs could sell 100% of their awarded capacity, it would not represent 8.3% of peak system need today. And again, this would really realize the 100% growth envisioned in that decision. That decision, it's 2006-031, sorry, that's a typo. So the second option is to cap third-party procurement only. So again, one of our biggest, I guess, worries with the decision as it was adopted is the fact that IOUDR effectively preempts third party and crowds out third party because it's just so much larger. So one option is that essentially the 8.3% cap stands, but it only applies to directly procured demand response for each LSC. Because LSCs do not directly procure IOUDR, they cannot control whether or how much of it is in their portfolio. So from that perspective, it makes sense to apply this cap to competitively procured demand response only. Next slide. And the last option is to allow behind the meter resources, whether PDRs or storage, to count toward bucket one. So decision 2006-031 opened the door for this. It said we anticipate further exploration of whether specific DR programs with appropriate characteristics should be included in bucket one before the DR bucket constrains development of these resources. So, but I would argue that if we have, again, two players that are already meeting LSCs at their cap, the buckets are already constraining the development of this resource. And there's not seemed to be really a reason to wait to discuss this issue. This is something that we can discuss in this proceeding, in this track 3B, and open up bucket one to resources that can meet those operational characteristics. At best, it would encourage better, more available models of DR, and at the very least, it would free up the DR bucket to the truly use-limited resources. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. So we are 1 minute away from our 4:30 deadline or cutoff time. So I'm not sure, Simona, I was going to check if there's any kind of low-hanging fruits in the chat box that we could have Maria answer.
I think the only question isn't exactly about her presentation, so. No.
Okay. All right. Well, I'd prefer to maybe use the last few minutes to just kind of discuss maybe process, if there's any questions on process. What was the question in the chat?
What category is storage?
Oh, okay.
Generally, it's going to be bucket one if it's 4-hour dispatch.
All right. And I know, Maria, you are just putting up this proposal to parties now because this wasn't in the track 3B August 7th filings. But if parties have questions about the proposal put forward in the slide deck, please reach out to Maria. And I will, I guess, sign off for the day with the current schedule. We'll have revised proposals due on December 6th, is it December 18th? December 18th. And from now until then, we encourage parties to really reach out to one another with their concerns. If they want them addressed in a proposals revisions, then that would be the way of doing that. And I want to thank all the panelists and speakers and our RA staff for their coordination and getting this meeting running smoothly today. And I hope everybody has a great end of their day or rest of the afternoon. All right. Thank you.